He left his life of crime behind and wanted to forget the past. But when girls from his tribe ran to his house in the middle of the night, fleeing from the gang he once belonged to, he couldn't close the door. Now his former comrades are coming back for him. Subscribe to the channel and write in the comments which city you are watching from. The land around Jack Collins's homestead stretched wide and silent, a patchwork of pale grass and stubborn shrubs, broken only by the dark smudge of a distant tree line. His cabin sat alone on the edge of that expanse, a weathered structure of hand-hewn logs, with a roof silvered by years of sun and rain. The front porch sagged slightly in the middle, where the boards had warped, and the single rocking chair creaked in the wind, as if whispering to itself. To any traveler passing through, the place looked like the last remnant of a man unwilling to join the restless tide of the frontier. To Jack, it was all he needed, a boundary between himself and a world that had taken too much. He had built this life deliberately, plank by plank, after years of blood and noise. Once, he had been known as a sharp-eyed rider, with an easy draw and a knack for surviving other men's grudges. The name Collins had meant something in the scattered settlements and mining towns where law came late and death came early. But that name had been stained the day his younger brother Thomas died in a skirmish Jack had helped start. Thomas had been just 22, full of restless pride, eager to follow his older brother and prove himself. The ambush had been sloppy, a drunken scheme to chase a small hunting party from the local tribe who were crossing a disputed valley. It should have been a simple show of force. Instead, a single arrow found Thomas's chest while Jack was busy firing into the trees. Jack still remembered the moment, his brother's startled gasp, the bloom of red on his shirt, and then the silence. Nothing that came after the gunfire, the retreat, the drinking that night had been able to drown out the image. Jack walked away soon after. He sold his horse and his pistols for enough to buy the stretch of land where no one would follow him. The house he built with his own hands was rough but sturdy, its imperfections suited to a man who wanted no visitors and no conversations about the past. He learned to mend fences, tend a small crop of corn, keep a few animals alive. Work was steady and silence was what he craved. He didn't stop remembering, but he stopped participating in the kind of violence that had defined him. His days followed a rhythm as predictable as the seasons. At dawn, he would rise to the smell of strong coffee boiling over the small iron stove. The first light always came soft and pink over the plains, stretching long shadows of the fence posts across the dust. He would check on the horses, just 2 of them now, one a shaggy bay mare, and the other an aging black gelding too slow for anything but hauling wood. Then he would walk the lines of his property, kicking at the dry earth, patching holes where coyotes might slip through. Some mornings he cut wood in the sparse grove beyond his pasture, the steady thud of the axe a kind of meditation. Other days he worked on the outbuildings, hammering loose boards back into place or tightening the hinges on the heavy barn doors. The barn itself smelled of hay, dust, and old memories. Beneath its floor, long hidden by stacked barrels and burlap sacks, lay a trap door to an underground room Jack's father had once dug. Years ago, it had been used to hide runaways fleeing bondage, back when the borderlands were still dangerous for anyone seeking freedom. Jack hadn't stepped down there in years, but he knew the place remained dry and sound. The timbers still held, the air still cool. Sometimes he would catch himself looking toward that corner of the barn without knowing why, as if the past whispered to him. Solitude had made him lean and watchful. His hair, once a deep brown, had streaked with gray before its time, and the sun had carved hard lines into his face. But his hands were still strong. He could split logs with a single stroke, lift a barrel of water, fix the leather on a saddle. The rifle that hung above the hearth hadn't been fired in years, yet it remained oiled and ready. Jack told himself he kept it only for wolves or the rare rattlesnake near the barn, but deep down he knew he couldn't quite sever that part of himself. Violence had once been his language, and though he no longer wished to speak it, the words hadn't left his bones. From time to time he rode into the nearest settlement, a loose cluster of buildings 2 hours south, to trade for supplies. Those trips reminded him why he lived apart. The saloon was always noisy, filled with men quick to talk about land, money, and enemies. There was always a story of someone chasing someone else off property, of bounties and raids. He kept his hat low and his mouth shut, buying what he needed and heading back before dusk. Still, even in silence, he could not avoid the pulse of the frontier's unrest. On one such trip, while he bartered for coffee and nails, he overheard talk that turned his stomach. A group of settlers by the bar laughed coarsely about trouble with the local tribe. Someone said a few young women had gone missing from a camp upriver. Some claimed they'd run off. Others said they'd been taken by a gang that had been prowling for weeks. One man, red-faced from drink, made a crude joke about hunting squaw trophies. Another spoke of revenge, his voice low and mean, as if he wanted someone to challenge him so he could draw his gun. Jack stood still, eyes fixed on the floorboards, the weight of their words settling over him. He felt the old disgust rise, the same sickness he'd felt when he watched Thomas die for nothing but pride and cruelty. On the ride home that evening, the horizon stretched endless and gold before him, yet he felt no peace. Memories pressed in with every hoofbeat, the arrogance of his younger self, the blind rage of men drunk on conquest, the waste of life. It all seemed to echo in the distant hills. He tried to push it down. These weren't his fights anymore. He was done paying the price of other people's hatred. And yet, a small voice inside him, the one that had led him to build secret hiding spaces long ago, whispered that the world would never let a man stay neutral forever. That night, the wind picked up, rattling the shutters and whistling through gaps in the roof. Jack sat by the stove, mending a torn work glove with thread and needle, but his mind stayed restless. The lantern's glow danced on the walls, illuminating the rifle where it rested above the hearth. He stared at it for a long time, as if testing his resolve. He told himself he would never use it against another man again, that he'd buried that part of his life along with his brother. But the sound of those settlers' laughter, their hunger for cruelty, clung to him like smoke. He couldn't shake the feeling that trouble was moving his way, carried on the night wind. Out beyond his window, the land was a black ocean, broken only by the silver edge of the moon. Somewhere in that darkness lay trails, rivers, and the scattered camps of people whose lives had been uprooted for generations. Somewhere, perhaps tonight, someone was running. Jack didn't know it yet, but the quiet he had fought so hard to build was already trembling, the first ripples of a storm moving toward his doorstep. The night began, as so many others on the open plain, with the wind sighing through the grass and the distant call of coyotes echoing across the dark. Jack Collins had banked the fire low and lain down on his narrow cot, his body heavy from a day of mending fences and hauling water from the well. Sleep came slowly, thick with the restless memories that so often haunted him. But sometime after midnight, he woke with a start, though at first he could not name why. It was not a dream that pulled him back from slumber, but a sound, faint yet wrong against the usual quiet. The muted thud of hooves carrying weight across dry ground. He lay still, ears straining. A breeze rattled the shutters, and the horses in the corral gave a nervous snort. Then came another noise, closer now. The sharp yelp of a dog carried thinly on the air. Jack sat up, the hair rising on his arms. Travelers rarely passed this way so deep in the night, and those who did were either desperate or dangerous. He rose, pulled on his boots, and moved carefully to the window. Outside, the moon floated pale above the horizon, washing the yard in silver light. The world seemed empty, but for the shifting shadows of his fence and the whisper of dry grass. Yet the unease stayed. He opened the door slowly, stepping out onto the porch. The boards creaked beneath his weight. From somewhere beyond the barn came the faint crunch of feet on dirt. Jack's pulse quickened. He thought first of thieves' men come to steal his horses or supplies, but then he caught sight of movement near the edge of the yard. 3 small shapes detached themselves from the darker mass of the prairie and hurried toward the outbuildings, stumbling more than running. As they neared, the moonlight revealed faces. Young, gaunt with fear, eyes wide and glinting. They were girls, perhaps no more than late teens, dressed in torn buckskin and rough cotton, their hair loose and tangled. One limped badly, leaning on another for support. The third glanced back repeatedly, as if expecting pursuit at any moment. Jack froze where he stood. In an instant he understood. These were no lost travelers. They were the missing daughters and sisters of the tribe, whose hunting grounds spread north of the river, the very ones he had heard men bragging about in the saloon. And if they had come this far south, if they were alone and wounded, then whoever was chasing them could not be far behind. For a long breath, he did not move. His first instinct was to stay invisible, to let them pass, and keep his life simple. But one of the girls faltered and nearly fell, catching herself with a cry so soft it was almost swallowed by the wind. The sound pierced him. It was the same note of helplessness he had once heard, when his brother's life poured out onto a cold hillside. Jack clenched his jaw, the memory hot and unwelcome. He had sworn off choosing sides. He had promised himself never again to step into someone else's war. Yet here the war was, standing ragged and terrified in his yard. He stepped off the porch. The girls recoiled, backing toward the barn with terror in their eyes. Jack lifted his hands, palms out, showing them he carried no weapon. He said nothing. Words would not help. He moved slowly, letting them see his face, hoping his stillness might calm their panic. One of them trembled so violently she nearly dropped the other she was supporting. They were exhausted, barefoot, streaked with dirt and dried blood. Their breaths came in quick, silent gasps, the kind of breathing that belongs to prey that has run for miles. From far to the west came the low murmur of men's voices, faint but real. Dogs barked again, closer this time. The sound made the girls flinch and cling to one another. Jack turned his head in that direction, gauging distance. The hunters would not be long. He looked back at the 3 before him, creatures of bone and fear, and felt the old war inside himself flare to life. He could turn them away now, send them into the night to buy himself safety. He could close the door and pretend they had never been here. No one would know. But he would know, and that knowledge would rot him from the inside out. Without another thought, he motioned toward the barn, then toward the ground. The girls hesitated, exchanging frightened looks, but the desperation in them overrode caution. Slowly they followed as he led the way. Inside the barn, it smelled of hay and dust, familiar to him, but strange to them. In the far corner, hidden beneath years of clutter, lay the old trap door. Jack shoved aside barrels and sacks, his muscles working silently as the girls huddled together and watched with wide eyes. He lifted the heavy hatch, revealing the dark mouth of the storage cellar his father had once dug. It was deeper than it looked, lined with rough stone and timber. Cool air rose from it, smelling of earth and old wood. Jack found an unused lantern on a nearby shelf, struck a match, and lowered it down first so they could see the space below. Then he gestured for them to climb in. They hesitated only a moment before obeying, one helping the injured one down the ladder, while the other clutched the edge, eyes darting to the door, as if the hunters might burst in at any second. Jack followed with an old blanket and a jug of water, placing them in the corner. From a high shelf, he took down a sack of dried beans and a loaf of coarse bread he had baked earlier that day. It was little, but it might keep them alive for a while. When they were all below, he lowered the hatch gently and covered it with sacks and loose hay until the seam disappeared into the floor. Standing back, he studied his work with a soldier's eye. It would hold, at least for the night. Only then did he return to the house. His hands shook slightly as he reached for the rifle above the hearth. The weight of it felt both foreign and familiar, a tool from a past life long buried. He checked the action, rubbed oil along the metal, and loaded each cartridge with steady precision. Then he tested the locks on his doors and windows, reinforcing the shutters with spare planks. He dragged a heavy table against the front entrance, breathing slow and deep to keep his heart from racing. Every movement felt like crossing a line he had sworn never to cross again. He spent the next hours preparing in silence. He scattered a thin tripwire of rusted barbed wire across the gate to the yard, hoping to slow riders if they came fast. He set buckets of water near the walls to fight fire should they try to burn him out. In the barn, he loosened the support beams he had once meant to repair. If men stormed in there, he could bring the whole thing down with a single shove. Each task felt like laying bricks on a path back to the man he had been, and with each brick, his chest grew heavier. Before dawn, he stood on the porch again, rifle in hand, and looked out into the vast dark. Somewhere out there, the hunters were moving. He could hear them faintly now, the crack of twigs, the distant laughter of men certain of their prize. Torches glimmered like fireflies far off, swaying with the rhythm of riders. The sound of dogs carried sharper on the cold air, closer with every minute. His horses shifted nervously in their pen, catching the scent of strangers. Fear slid coldly down Jack's spine, but beneath it burned something else. A grim resolve, the kind he had not felt since his youth. He had chosen this. No one had forced him to open that trapdoor. Whatever came now was the cost of that choice. He thought of Thomas, of the arrow and the blood, and the guilt that had followed him like a shadow. Maybe tonight he could pay a little of that debt back. He stayed there as the horizon paled, watching the line where the plains met the sky. The first light bled slowly upward, staining the world in muted gray. He saw movement then, a cluster of riders topping a distant rise, their shapes black against the growing dawn. More followed behind them, a ragged line of men with rifles slung across their shoulders and dogs straining at leashes. Even at this distance, he could feel their hunger, their easy cruelty. They were coming straight for his land. Jack took a long breath and let it out slowly. Behind him, under feet of earth and timber, 3 young lives waited in terrified silence. Around him lay the work of his own hands, fences, barns, the home he had built to keep the world at bay. Before him rode the world itself, cruel and armed, ready to smash through anything that stood in its way. He tightened his grip on the rifle. The quiet life he had carved out was gone. The night had brought the war back to his door, and at last, after years of running from it, Jack Collins stood ready to meet it. Dawn crept across the plains in a thin, hesitant light, washing the land in pale silver before the first true gold of day broke over the horizon. Jack Collins stood on the porch, rifle in hand, watching that light crawl across the dry grass and reach for the distant riders. They were closer now than they had been in the gray pre-dawn, a ragged string of horsemen silhouetted against the sky. He counted at least a dozen shapes, some hunched, some upright and careless, but all armed. Torches guttered low, fading in the morning but still visible as smudges of fire. The dogs at the front tugged on their leashes, eager, sensing the chase was nearly done. Behind Jack's stoic face, a storm brewed. He had not felt this kind of tension in years, the sharp edge of survival sharpening every sense until the world seemed unnaturally clear. He could hear the restless shifting of his horses in their pen, the dry squeal of the corral gate in the wind, the tiny rustle of hay as something small scurried in the barn. Beneath his boots, the porch board seemed alive with his own pulse, yet he stood still, forcing calm into his limbs. Panic would kill him faster than any bullet. Inside the house, everything was as ready as he could make it. The front door was barred with heavy timber and reinforced with a table turned on its side. Buckets of water stood near the windows to fight sparks or flames. Extra ammunition lay on the shelf by the hearth, close enough to reach quickly. He had spent hours in the darkness tightening shutters and hammering loose boards until his hands bled. In the barn, the work had been quieter, but no less grim. Beams loosened, ropes cut, so that a single sharp pull could drop the structure on anyone who entered. The cellar beneath the barn floor was hidden again under hay and sacks, invisible to any casual search. Down there, 3 frightened young women huddled together in the cool dark, trusting him with their lives, though they had no reason to trust any white man. Jack felt the weight of that trust like a stone in his gut. The riders were spreading out now, forming a loose half-circle as they approached. It was a hunter's pattern, meant to pen prey in and cut off escape. Jack knew the tactic well. He had once ridden in such formations himself. He stepped back inside, closed the door softly, and checked the rifle one more time. His heart was heavy but steady. Whatever happened, the choice had already been made in the cold hours of the night when he opened the trap door. Soon he could hear them clearly. Men laughing, shouting to one another, the ring of bits and stirrups as they slowed near his fence line. The dogs bayed, wild and sharp, their cries echoing off the empty land. Hoofbeats thudded closer, then stopped. A man's voice called out, rough with command but mocking in tone, demanding he come out. Jack said nothing. Silence was answer enough. The first knock on his piece came not with words, but with action. Someone rode hard at the front gate, testing it with weight. The barbed wire Jack had stretched across it snagged the horse and sent it rearing. Curses filled the air, followed by laughter from the others. Then boots hit dirt, and men spread toward the barn and the back of the house. Jack moved to the front window and waited. When a shadow appeared past the corner of the porch, he fired once, the shot cracking like thunder in the still morning. The figure dropped, screaming. For a heartbeat, the yard froze. Then chaos broke. Gunfire erupted from 3 sides at once, bullets splintering the wooden shutters, thudding into the door. Jack ducked back, reloaded fast, then leaned to fire again, forcing the attackers to scatter. Smoke drifted through a hole in the window frame where a bullet had punched through. He coughed, eyes stinging, but stayed low and deliberate. Years ago he had lived by this rhythm, and though age and time had dulled his speed, the knowledge was still in his bones. Outside, the gang regrouped, shouting over the noise. He heard them urge one another toward the barn, where they must have thought to flank him or set fire to his supplies. Jack moved swiftly through the house to the side door, slipping out the back as quietly as he could. Keeping low, he crossed to a small rise of earth that gave him sight of the barn's entrance. 2 men were creeping toward it, rifles ready, with a third behind them carrying a torch. Jack steadied his breath, aimed, and dropped the torchbearer first. The other 2 spun, startled, and he fired again, sending them diving for cover. One of the dogs broke free and lunged toward him, teeth bared. Jack shot it mid-leap and grimaced, hating the necessity even as he pumped another round into the chamber. Shouts rang out as the rest of the gang spotted him. Bullets kicked up dirt around his boots. He turned and ran for the barn, not to flee, but to lure them in. His boots pounded the packed earth as he slid through the open door, vaulted over a low pen, and yanked on the rope he had set the night before. There was a groan of timber, then a crash like thunder as the loosened beams and heavy hayloft came down. The first man through the doorway had no chance. The second was pinned by falling boards and hay, his rifle skittering across the floor. The third scrambled back, screaming to the others that it was a trap. Dust billowed thick and choking, filling the air with the smell of splintered wood and dry straw. Jack crouched behind the wreckage, heart hammering, and fired twice into the confusion before ducking away. Cries of pain and rage followed him as he slipped out a side gap he had prepared. He sprinted back toward the house, his lungs burning, just as the remaining riders opened fire. The yard had become a battlefield. Smoke curled from the barn, where sparks had caught in the straw. Men were shouting orders, some rushing to help their trapped companions, others swinging around to encircle the house. Jack slid behind a rain barrel, reloaded, and shot again, forcing them to dive for cover. One bullet tore through his sleeve, grazing the skin beneath. He felt the hot sting, but kept moving. Another smashed into the porch rail inches from his head, showering him with splinters. He retreated inside, slamming the door and bracing it with his shoulder while he caught his breath. The room smelled of sweat, smoke, and gun oil. His hands trembled for just a second before he forced them still. Outside, the gang regrouped, furious now. He could hear their leader shouting a deep, commanding voice that cut through the chaos. More gunfire slammed into the house, testing its strength. Someone threw a torch toward the roof. Jack darted up and batted it away with a wet blanket, his movements quick and practiced. Time blurred into a tense dance of attack and defense. They tried the windows. He drove them back with carefully placed shots. They tried the rear. He slipped out a side door and ambushed them before vanishing again. They circled and whooped, hoping to scare him into rashness, but he had lived through worse. Each minute he held them off felt like a small victory, though he knew he could not outlast them forever. His ammunition was finite, his strength fading with every exertion. The house shuddered under the onslaught. At one point, he caught sight of their leader clearly for the first time, a broad-shouldered man with a gray beard and a long coat, riding a tall roan horse and barking orders as calmly as if directing cattle. There was no wildness in his eyes, only cold calculation. Jack knew men like him, the kind who wore cruelty as a tool, not a passion. That man would not give up easily. He would burn the place to the ground if it meant finishing the hunt. By midday, the sun was high and merciless, baking the yard into a haze of heat. The gang had lost several men to his traps and bullets, but they still outnumbered him badly. Their patience was thinning. Twice they tried to set fire to the house, riding close to throw burning rags onto the porch roof, and twice Jack fought the flames back with water and blankets, coughing on the smoke that filled the rooms. His throat was raw, his muscles trembling from exhaustion, but he refused to stop. Through it all, a strange calm underlay his fear. He had not expected to feel this way, to find in himself, after years of silence, the same steady hand and cold focus that once made him a feared gunman. But it was there, and though he despised the reasons, he used it now for something better than pride or pay. Each shot he fired bought another moment of life for the girls hidden beneath the barn. Each trap sprung was a small defiance against the cruelty that had ruled his younger years. As the afternoon wore on, the gang pulled back to regroup beyond rifle range. Jack knew this lull would not last. They were planning something, perhaps a final rush. Perhaps a siege to starve him out. He leaned his back against the door and let himself breathe, sweat dripping from his brow, chest rising and falling in heavy pools. The silence was not peaceful. It was the quiet before another storm. But in that silence, he felt, for the first time in many years, something like purpose. He had chosen the hard road, and there was no turning back. When the wind shifted, he caught faint sounds from beneath the earth. A muffled sob, the scrape of movement. The girls were still there, alive, waiting. He closed his eyes briefly and let that knowledge steal him. Whatever came next, he would hold this line as long as he could. Outside, he could hear the riders mounting again, the creak of saddles, the harsh bark of orders. The siege was far from over. Night would come soon, and with it the next wave. Jack wiped his brow, lifted his rifle, and prepared to face the darkness. Dusk slid across the land like a great shadow, swallowing the last pale gold of the afternoon until only a deep, smoldering red clung to the horizon. Jack Collins crouched by the shattered window of his cabin and watched the enemy reassemble beyond rifle range. The lull that had stretched through the late day was over. Shapes moved against the dying light men on horseback, conferring with gestures, the gray-bearded leader pointing with a long arm toward the house. The dogs barked restlessly, eager for another push. Smoke still curled thinly from the wreckage of the barn where his trap had collapsed, but the fire had burned itself to ash, leaving behind only the smell of scorched hay and timber. Several of the riders had not risen from that ruin. Others limped or sat bandaged. Yet enough of them remained to finish what they had started. Jack's shoulder ached where a splinter of wood had cut deep, and his arm throbbed from the graze of a bullet. He had bound both wounds as best he could, with strips torn from an old shirt, but blood had seeped through, drying in dark patches. His mouth was dry, his whole body heavy with exhaustion. Still, when he looked out at the gathering enemy, he felt not despair, but a strange, clear steadiness. This was the last act, and he knew it. He would not run. Behind him, under feet of wood and earth, 3 young lives breathed in terrified silence. They had trusted him, and he would not break that trust now. The leader raised his arm, and a sharp whistle split the evening air. The gang moved like a single organism, half dismounted and began to creep low across the grass, rifles ready. The others stayed mounted, circling wide to flank the house from the sides and rear. A few carried torches already lit, their flames licking hungrily at the dark. They meant to burn him out this time, to smoke him from his shelter and finish him in the open. Jack took a long breath, wiped the sweat and soot from his brow, and steadied the rifle against the window frame. The first of the creeping figures came into range, and he fired. One went down silently. The others scattered, returning fire that shattered what remained of the shutters. The battle surged again, louder and closer than before. Bullets punched through the walls, splinters flying like angry wasps. Jack retreated deeper into the room, keeping low, counting each shot. He fired carefully, aiming not to waste ammunition. 2 riders tried to rush the porch, but he dropped one and forced the other to dive behind a water trough. Then came the torches, arcing through the air like falling stars. One landed on the roof and clung there, smoking. Jack climbed onto the table barricading the door, grabbed a soaked blanket from the water bucket, and beat at the flames until they died with a hiss. Another torch smashed through a side window, setting a curtain alight. He tore it down and stamped on it with boots, coughing in the thick smoke that began to fill the cabin. The gray-bearded leader shouted something sharp and cold. A fresh wave of men rushed the back wall, breaking through a shutter and climbing halfway in before Jack met them with point-blank fire. The recoil slammed into his shoulder, but 2 more enemies fell screaming into the dirt. One managed to fire back, and the shot caught Jack along the ribs, a hot slice that nearly drove him to his knees. He staggered behind the hearth, teeth gritted against the pain, and forced himself to reload with trembling hands. The world narrowed to smoke, blood, and the rough edge of survival. Night fell fully now, and with it came darkness pierced only by the flicker of flames and the erratic muzzle flashes of rifles. Jack's house groaned under the punishment. Boards split, glass shattered, and still he held on. The gang regrouped yet again, this time fewer in number but harder, meaner. He could hear the leader barking orders for a final assault. They would not leave until he was dead. He wiped blood from his cheek and forced himself to stand straighter. His breath came ragged but steady. He had fought many men before for money, for pride, for a cause he barely believed in. Tonight, for the first time, he fought simply to keep innocence alive. The final charge came sudden and brutal. They rode at the house from 3 sides at once, howling to cover the thunder of hooves. Dogs surged ahead, snapping and lunging. The first hit the wire Jack had strung and yelped, tangled. The second leapt clear and made for the porch. Jack shot it mid-run and swung the rifle toward the riders just as the front door shuddered under a heavy blow. Another came, and the wood cracked. He retreated to the back room, where he had stacked spare boards and ammunition, firing as he moved. Flames licked at the eaves again, smoke curling down the hallway. The air was choking, the heat oppressive. Then the door gave way. 3 men stormed inside, one holding a pistol, the others with knives and clubs. Jack fired from the hip, dropping the first. The second crashed into him, knocking the rifle aside, and they grappled fiercely in the smoky gloom. Pain tore through Jack's wounded side as the man's knife scraped his ribs. He slammed his elbow into the attacker's face, seized a nearby iron poker from the hearth, and swung it with all his fading strength. The man crumpled, unmoving. The third rushed him, but Jack swung again, a desperate arc that broke bone with a dull crack. He barely had time to breathe before the gray-bearded leader stepped through the ruin of the doorway, calm amid the chaos. In one hand, he held a long revolver, gleaming in the firelight. His eyes were cold and certain. They locked on Jack with a look that said this had become personal. Jack raised his rifle, but the man fired first. The bullet ripped into Jack's shoulder, spinning him back against the wall. Agony exploded through him, and he nearly dropped the weapon. But somehow, he stayed upright. He forced the rifle to his shoulder with his good arm, aimed through the haze of pain, and squeezed the trigger. The shot struck true. The leader jerked back, eyes wide in shock, and fell heavily to the floorboards. Silence fell as sudden as a cut rope. The remaining men, seeing their commander down and more of their comrades dead or wounded, hesitated. One fired a half-hearted shot that went wide. Another cursed and turned to run. Within moments, the survivors scrambled out into the night, retreating toward their horses. The dogs, those still alive, slunk after them. Soon the only sounds were the pounding of hooves, fading into the darkness, and the crackle of dying flames. Jack sank to the floor, chest heaving. Blood soaked his shirt and slicked his hands. His house was wrecked, windows shattered, door torn from its hinges, smoke curling from blackened rafters. But it still stood, and so did he. For a long time he simply sat there, listening to the night reclaim its silence. His body trembled with exhaustion. But somewhere beneath the pain, a deep, quiet satisfaction stirred. He had held his ground. He had not abandoned those who needed him. A faint creak came from the barn, then the whisper of cautious steps. The trapdoor shifted, and 3 figures emerged into the moonlit yard. The young women moved like ghosts, hesitant, their eyes wide as they took in the wreckage. One of them gasped softly at the sight of the bodies. Another covered her mouth with trembling hands. Yet they didn't flee. Instead, they came slowly to Jack, where he sat, slumped against the wall. The tallest knelt beside him and pressed a cool hand to his brow. The others found cloth and water from the well, soaking the rags, and cleaning the blood from his wounds. They worked silently, their fear replaced by something gentler, a gratitude too deep for words. Jack let them help, too weak now to protest. He felt himself drifting, but forced his eyes to stay open, to bear witness to the simple truth that he had done what was right. Somewhere in the night an owl hooted, lonely and soft. The girls bound his wounds as best they could, then settled nearby, keeping watch like silent sentinels. For the first time in decades, he felt the crushing weight of his past shift, just a little, as if some part of the debt had been paid. By morning, the sky was a pale wash of rose and gold, the air cool and clean after the smoke of battle. The yard was littered with the scars of violence, spent shells, broken weapons, the charred skeleton of the barn. The attackers were gone, leaving only silence and the distant cries of waking birds. Jack managed to stand with the help of the girls, leaning heavily on one of them as they guided him to the porch. He sank into the battered rocking chair, breath shallow but steady, and watched the sunrise spill across the plains. It felt different now, not just another day of hiding from the world, but the first day of something earned. Later, as the sun climbed higher, figures appeared on the northern horizon. At first, Jack tensed, but these were not enemies. They came quietly, on foot and horseback, moving with solemn grace. Men and women from the tribe approached his yard, but stopped well short of the house. They did not call out. They did not enter. Instead, 2 elders stepped forward and placed a folded blanket on the ground, woven with colors of earth and sky, marked with symbols he did not know but felt the weight of. Beside it, they set a carved wooden amulet, shaped like a running wolf. No words were spoken. When the gifts were laid, the group turned and slipped back into the land, leaving only their silent tribute. Jack sat on the porch and stared at the offerings, throat tight. Slowly, painfully, he rose and went to pick them up. The blanket was soft and warm beneath his fingers, the amulet cool and smooth, worn by many hands. He turned it over and over, feeling the care in its making. These were not the thanks of people quick to forgive, but an acknowledgement that his stand had meant something. It was more than he had expected, more than he deserved. He returned to the chair, the amulet clutched in his rough hands, and let the rising light wash over him. His body hurt with every breath, and the future was uncertain. The house would need rebuilding, the land tending. He might not live many more years after such wounds. But in that moment, none of it mattered. He had faced down the darkness he once served and chosen a different path. He had sheltered the innocent and held the line alone. Somewhere, he thought, his brother might rest easier now. As the morning deepened into day, the plains stretched endless and silent before him. The wind stirred the grass, carrying with it the faint scent of smoke and wild sage. Jack closed his eyes for a time and simply listened. For the first time in a long, long while, the silence felt like peace rather than exile. It was not the silence of running away, but of a man who had finally stopped fleeing himself. If this story moved you, make sure to subscribe so you never miss the next one. Take a moment to watch the next video waiting for you right now. There are more powerful stories you won't want to miss. And don't forget to share this video with friends and family. Some stories are too meaningful to keep to yourself.